Welcome everybody to this second session of our online workshop, Participant Engagement in Longitudinal Population Studies and Cohorts, that is organized by my colleague Isabel Boudin-Bliosne from Biobank Norway and myself, Monica Cano-Abadia from BBMRI-ERIC. This is a two-day workshop. The last session we had was very interactive and very engaging, so we hope that we will enjoy also today's session together. The session is being recorded and will be made available online on our website. And after every speaker's presentations, there will be a very short Q&A, 5 minutes. Please write your questions on the chat box, and I will make sure to ask the questions, collect the questions and ask them to the speakers in every Q&A session. There's a longer Q&A session at the end. So all your questions, most of your questions will be answered by the end of today's session. So please engage with the session using the chat box. Without further ado, I hand over to my colleague Isabel, who will present the agenda and the first speaker of today.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone to this second session. So today we have 4 presentations, of which 3 are from different cohorts. So we have a pretty tight schedule today. So I suggest we start right away with our first speaker, and I'm very pleased to introduce Shona Kerr, who is project manager of the Viking 2 study. And she will tell us about Viking Genes and how Viking Genes handle the feedback of individual research results to participants.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the work we've been doing on the Viking Genes cohorts at the MRC Human Genetics Unit at the University of Edinburgh. So you see my title there, and today I'm going to begin by giving you a short introduction to the cohorts, and throughout I'll briefly mention our participant engagement strategy. I'm going to define actionable genetic variants, tell you what we have done so far with returning results, making use of people's phenotype, and then finish towards with our progress towards a more general protocol for return of results. So the Viking Genes get their name because we are recruiting people with ancestry from the Northern Isles of Scotland, that's Orkney and Shetland. There's the map of Northern Europe there, and the red blob is Shetland. I seem to have lost my other red blob, but directly below that is Orkney. And our genetic analysis work confirmed the not unexpected finding that these people, these populations, have the highest degree of Norse blood in the British Isles and Ireland. And that gave us the kind of colloquial term of Viking genes. I'm going to tell you about 3 cohorts: Orchids, Viking Health Study Shetland, and Viking 2. And these are their logos showing the maps of the islands themselves. So the first 2 cohorts were recruited between 2005 and 15, 2,000 participants in each. These involved clinic visits with plenty of measurements, and consent was taken for feedback of that phenotype, but consent was not taken for feedback of genetic results. And this was really usual practice at the time, as I say, up till 2015. And these cohorts become longitudinal mainly by virtue of the electronic health record linkage that we have. So we can follow health trajectories over time. And we also are able to do some resampling, and we plan to do that shortly. So these 2 cohorts have supported hundreds of research papers, and the majority of those are in collaboration with other cohorts, particularly in so-called GWAS consortia, genome-wide association studies, although some papers have focused on the cohorts individually. But over the years, As genetic data became more and more precise and detailed as sequencing costs reduced, we noticed that this research using the increasingly detailed genetic data focused on rare variants and particularly indicated there was a potential for these populations to have a different pool of medically relevant rare gene variants. And when we got the first tranche of sequence data, we began by looking for a gene that, or a variant that we were aware of in a gene called KCNH2, which is involved in this cardiac syndrome called long QT syndrome, which, if untreated, can lead to cardiac arrest, unexpected cardiac arrest, and even death. And so we used the sequence analysis that we had on a subset of our cohort to look for this variant, this actionable variant. And before I go any further, I just want to be clear what I mean by an actionable variant or an actionable finding. In this context, it's a gene change that is linked to a condition or disease that can be prevented or improved by treatment. And I'll also talk about AVs, and I mean an actionable genetic variant. So this was our paper a couple of years ago, published in 2019. And what it, in essence, described was our analysis of 5 actionable variant carriers from Shetland. And these fell into 2 families, but the 2 families really didn't connect in the recorded pedigree or in genealogical records. And it was only by doing some clever genetics that we were able to show there was a distant relationship from a common ancestor. And the implications of that are that in a clinical setting, when an index case of a person carrying an actionable variant is identified, there's a process of cascade testing where relatives are offered testing for the same variant, and the testing spreads out across the family and across the pedigree. But in this case, it wouldn't be possible. And the more we thought about this, the more uncomfortable we started to feel, because it was pretty likely that this family B hadn't been involved in clinical genetics, hadn't been found by the cascade testing. And so we possessed information about these participants that could be really useful for them to have. As I mentioned, we didn't have consent to return the genetic data, but in this particular instance, the genetic variant has an effect on a phenotype that we had measured. In this case, it's visible on an ECG trace. And we did have consent to return phenotypes. So we sent a carefully worded letter to the participants' general practitioners, their primary care physicians, alerting them to this research finding. And we felt, well, we've done what we could, and that's the end of it. However, we've also been very busy. At the same time, we were increasingly busy with our participant engagement efforts. And what I have here is a screenshot from the Viking Genes website, where we collected a whole range of volunteer stories, which many participants were delighted to share with us. And it turns out one of these stories, Ingrid's, was actually the lady who was in Family B, and turns out she was actually rather pleased to have been given this information, which was entirely unexpected. The NHS did its bit, extra tests, and she's now taking beta blockers. And she's also passed this variant on to her daughter, who was nothing to do with our study. So that was very gratifying and encouraging for the strategy of return of results. Although, of course, one participant, one family doesn't prove anything. And I also, as I've said, we couldn't return this result via the genetic data, so it's not a very it's not a mechanism that can be rolled on to other variants very easily. And for such surveys of actionable variants, a cohort really needs to have DNA sequence data. So we now have that on our first 4,000 participants in the earlier cohorts. And as we speak, we're focusing on an actionable variant which we found in 20 people descended from one island within the Orkney archipelago, and that's a so-called founder mutation. We didn't discover the variant, we uncovered it. It's been known to our colleagues in the NHS for many years. And there's just a wealth of information now online from across the world about these pathogenic variants in humans. And I've taken a screenshot here of the ClinVar database, which is one of these resources, where you can look up the variant of interest and find out what experts have decided about its pathogenicity. And so here's our variant showing that it is indeed a pathogenic risk for breast or ovarian cancer. And another amazing resource that's freely available online is a thing called Nomad, which has collected the sequence data from, well, ever-increasing numbers of research volunteers. And it's browsable in a way that the individuals are not identifiable. And in 140,000 people, there were no instances of our particular actionable variant. It also wasn't found in our 2,000 people in our Shetland cohort, but we had 20 instances in orchids. We also looked in the UK Biobank, this phenomenal resource of research volunteers throughout the UK, and 200,000 exomes have been made available, and we found 4 people carrying the BRCA1 actionable rare variant. So to recap, 20 in orchids, about 1% of the people that we recruited to our study carry this rare variant. And within the females, we found 1 case of ovarian cancer. 4 carriers in the UK Biobank, and of the 3 females, 1 case of breast cancer. And that works out to be a nearly 500-fold increase in the variant frequency in Orkney. And our plan is to begin our return of genetic results with this variant to the women, the living women who carry it, who we found carry it. But even before we do that, there's already been some value of our research cohorts in more fully describing the burden of these rare clinical variants that segregate in these isolate populations. And that in turn should support better planning and delivery of genetic services by the NHS. Again, sort of all this happened roughly in parallel. We had been planning a new online study, a cohort, and launched this just before lockdown in January 2020. So no clinics, target of 4,000 volunteers, bringing us to a total across all 3 Viking Genes cohorts of 8,000 people, all with electronic health record linkage. And the DNA, instead of getting it from blood taken in a clinic, it's a spit and post saliva collection. Another relatively unusual feature of the Viking 2 cohort is that we were allowed to collect, we were allowed to recruit worldwide and collect samples and data essentially across the world. And our participants seem to like to see maps. Here's one of basically the whole world, showing where our volunteers live, and you can see plenty of participants, particularly in Canada and New Zealand. But for the purposes of this talk, a key point is that we have taken consent for return of selected actionable genetic results. And this was a lot of work actually to pull together, because we really had to begin with a kind of blank sheet of paper for our participant information sheet about return of results. And I think it's tricky to get the balance between explaining to people what DNA is, what a genetic finding is, so giving them enough information that they understand, but not too much that it it just gets out of hand. So hopefully we've achieved a good balance there. And an important point is that all our consent clauses, and this is just a screenshot of some of them, all of the consent clauses are mandatory, apart from the clause about return of results, in which case there's a yes/no option. And if people don't want return of results, that doesn't affect their participation in the study. And that's important because it respects the right not to know. There's been quite a lot of social science research on asking people in surveys, if they were able to get actionable results, would they be interested in having them? And the results are really overwhelmingly positive, that people think they would like to get these results back. And we've been gathering actual data on this by through our Viking 2 recruitment. We're not too far off our 4,000 target now, and gratifyingly we're running at about 98% of people do agree they would like to have results returned if we find them. I must stress that we would not be returning results entirely on our own. We're very much doing this in partnership with NHS clinical colleagues. And it's a real team effort, because we also have to generate the data to allow us to return results. And that starts by extraction of the DNA, the saliva samples that the participants provide. And unfortunately that's been delayed, but we're planning for the exome sequencing to begin early next year. And if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend this paper that came out just a month or so ago from the GA4GH. And a lot of work has gone into putting together an international policy on returning genomic research results. And it really acknowledges the medical benefits to the individuals who are participating in genomics research. But I thought it's a good point. One of their, I think, 6 main points is that they recognise that community involvement, community engagement is going to be key to all of this. What sort of level are we talking about? How rare is an actionable variant? Well, it turns out they're actually cumulatively not especially rare, roughly 2%. And that's exemplified again by the UK Biobank. This paper was published in Nature almost exactly a year ago, and I've taken a snip from the abstract showing that 2% of this population has a medically actionable variant. And they do say, it's relatively buried, but in this lovely paper, they do say the informed consent for the UK Biobank does not allow the return of these results to individuals or their healthcare providers. And that's fine, so long as the cohort has been clear to the volunteers that that's the basis of their participation. And of course, the UK Biobank was clear.
One more minute, please. Shona, one more minute, thank you.
I'm nearly done. Yeah, so I just want to be clear that this is not the same as sharing all the genetic data with volunteers. We're not disclosing information where there's no treatment. And the list keeps changing, so long-term engagement is important. I think I'll probably just about finish on this slide. The main points are the yes-no option. Where we're at is analysing the data. A key point is that we will do all we can at the research end to confirm the results, then engage with our clinical colleagues who will essentially implement their whole process of explanation and counselling, and they'll also test a fresh DNA sample, all with the consent of the participant and leading to health benefit. So next steps, we're going to implement this. We think there'll be about 100 people. I think I've covered these points. The return is limited, it respects volunteer preferences, it requires a long-term commitment to engagement, and there is direct benefit. So perhaps this could become increasingly important for engagement in longitudinal population studies. And finally, just thanks to everyone in our relatively small team. Particular shout out to Rachel Edwards, who's our comms manager, and you'll be seeing her shortly in her other project because she does this 2 days a week for Viking Genes. And of course the volunteers, without which none of this would be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Shona. We have several questions for you. The first one would be, did you have any problems with getting local health providers to agree with this? Do you have any pushback from them?
Yeah, that's a really critical point. So I have emphasised that a research group can't really do this all on their own. So we are very dependent on the clinicians supporting what we do. And I think some clinical geneticists are keener than others. It happens that we've got a really great team responsible for the Northern Isles populations. So they're actually very enthusiastic.
Yeah, another question about the involvement of staff is about the pre-test counseling. Do you provide any kind of pre-test counseling to your study participants?
So we don't. Yeah, again, this is a good point. So as a research team, no. We explain in the participant information sheet what we're going to do and that it's research data, and that if something is found, they would be taken through a range of steps by the NHS, by the clinical team, and then could get more information. So if they choose to respond to our letter by contacting their NHS, then they will go down through the pretty routine for them path of genetic counselling. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Another question is about the capacity of participants to understand about genetic findings. So do you have any feedback from them? Do you have a sense of whether the participants understand what genetic findings are? Do you have any control questions to them or similar?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So we haven't done any of that. And it's clear that the level of understanding of genetics is hugely variable in the general population, but it's increasing all the time. And I think there are social science surveys where people have investigated quite carefully, particularly what people understand after they've given consent. And I think clinicians often like to do really, really detailed consent. I believe the consent process for Genomics England is something like 27 pages of text. But there's evidence that, I don't mean to get at Genomics England, but sometimes you can give too much information. So we tried to focus on the key points, that it's up to you, you can change your mind. If something's found, which is only going to be 1 or 2 people in every 100, you still have a chance either to go forward with it or to stop. And I think in a way, just focusing on those key points is the way forward, because people will learn more step by step as they go along the pathway and engage with the healthcare providers.
Another question is about the list of potential actionable findings that you have. Do you update that list? Do you have any procedure to update that list? And if so, also, is there a reconsent procedure for additions to that list?
So again, we've been, hopefully we've covered that in the consent by saying we're not working to a defined list. So there's a whole range of lists, American College of Medical Genetics, that get regularly updated. Instead, we are very much going with the expertise of our clinicians and their knowledge of the population, I think it's dangerous to commit to a specific list because it will depend on a whole range of things, including potentially community engagement. So, we shouldn't need to go back to reconsent as new findings are made, but we always take this gradual approach. Even into the future, we'll say, we've made a new research finding. We think this may be of interest and benefit to you. If you want to know more, please contact, Dr. So-and-so.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question that will go to the final Q&A that we have later. And now Isabel will present our next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Shona, for a very clear and inspiring presentation. So let's move from Orkney and the Shetlands further southwest to Portugal. Our next speaker is Ana Cristina Santos. She's a researcher at the Generation 21 cohort study. I'm not going to make any attempt to say that in Portuguese. I tried before, it didn't work. And Ana Cristina will tell us about how to engage with cohorts of young participants. Ana Cristina, the floor is yours.
So, hi everyone, and I would like to thank you so much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be involved in such an interesting workshop. So the challenge that was presented to me was to talk a little bit about what type of activities do we in engaging our cohort participants, which is a birth cohort that is located here in Portugal. So let me see if this works. Okay, so with the emergence of the life course perspective and epidemiological thinking about the idea that experience happening early in life have long-term effects on the development of chronic disease, led obviously to the emergence of studies that better suited to deal with this perspective. And birth cohorts were established mainly all over Europe, but also in other parts of the world. But one of this type of longitudinal studies come along with challenges, and one of the major challenges is in fact in regards participation rate as well as attrition. So we know that from reviews that a decline in participation rate is expected when doing this type of studies, and this trend is unfortunately consistent along the birth cohorts that are already established. So engagement of participants becomes actually paramount as the loss and the attrition makes us deal with problems such as selection bias and problems regarding representativeness. So engagement of participants obviously refers to activities that are implemented during recruitment, consent, inform, during also in with regards to information to the participant, but also are activities that have as main objective to retain research participants in the projects. So these activities can be multiple, but usually they are sustained by the participants' feelings of altruism, solidarity, but also reciprocity. So I will focus on the activities that we have been developing in our birth cohort, Generation 21, which is a population-based birth cohort located in Portugal. As most of the birth cohorts that are in fact implemented, Generation 21 was developed with the objective to identify pregnancy and infancy characteristics that might relate to the development of health outcomes along the life course. We recruited around 8,500 participants from the metropolitan area of Portugal, and this recruitment happened in 2005-2006, and then the cohort has been followed throughout the childhood and now adolescence of our kids. So, and unfortunately, but as it was expected, obviously the participation rate has been declining over these years. And now I will try to focus a little bit on what we came up as engagement activities with our participants. Some of these engagement activities are in place since recruitment, while others are more recent and more adequate to the age strata of the participants. One of our main concerns was how we could retain participants in the transition from childhood to adolescence, because we expect and we knew that the decision, for instance, for participating during childhood mostly relies on the parents, but we expect that this could shift towards the adolescent making its own decision on participating in the project. So when we were planning the 13 years old evaluation, we decided to perform a qualitative study with the objective to explore what drove and what prevented participation, also on the dynamic of making the decision about participation, and exploring also the perceptions of the experience of participation, but also what our young participants felt that was most appealing regarding communication, but also regarding future modes of participation. So we did focus groups that were conducted among participants that were evaluated at the evaluation of the 10 years old evaluation. And here are some of the main results that we obtained. So mainly of our participants usually identified the physical evaluations more clearly, so they recall better the physical evaluations that they did, for instance, the questionnaires. They all identify the purpose of Generation 21 as the assessment of their global health status and doing this along their life course. They also see Generation 21 as a way of better understanding their physical and psychological characteristics, but also as potentially an early way of detecting health problems. And also they acknowledge that it is an important contribution to science participating in projects such as this. Also, most participants were glad to be involved in this project, but some of them identified some discomfort in some procedures, mainly related to, for instance, blood sampling. Boys still identify parents as those that were responsible for the decision-making regarding participation, but all of them felt that it was interesting and they were interested in continuing to participate with the research team. One of the critical results regarding this qualitative study related to the way that the participants felt that it was they would like to be approached with, but all of them prefer the face-to-face model of data collection because they really valued the interaction between them and the research team. And so when we planned we decided to structure the 13 years old evaluation as a face-to-face evaluation, but unfortunately we had to end it sooner than we anticipated because COVID hit and we were on lockdown from March 2020 onwards. Also, one of the things that changed during the years is the imagery of Generation 21, its logo, its lettering, and so on. And obviously, we made it as a way of reflecting the age of the participants. So in the beginning, it was the colors and the lettering was more related to babies and to this age strata. And at the 7 years old evaluation, we decided to change all of this. And this type of imaging is now obviously reflected on all types of communications that we have with our participants. So how do we get in touch with our participants? And this is also changed along the years, although some of these strategies remain stable. So, for instance, this is one of our first leaflets that was produced. It was from the recruitment, and it was where our project was introduced basically to the mothers. So most of our communication in early years was targeting parents and mothers specifically, and now it's becoming more target the adolescents and not so much the parents. Also, for instance, this is a very stable way of getting in touch, which is a Christmas card. We always send them a Christmas card, and we also always, every birthday of the kid, he receives a birthday card congratulating him on his birthday, obviously. As I was saying, as they grow older, the type of communication we try to make them the adolescent the target of the communication rather than the parents. And this is one of our most recent leaflets that was sent to the participant, explaining in the beginning of the 13 years old evaluation, explaining what was the evaluation, explaining what we were expecting from them, and why obviously their participation remained as important, obviously, as it is for us. Besides that, we do activities that provide feedback on participation. So, and this is rather stable throughout the cohort. So, for instance, all the physical examinations that the kid does in our evaluations, we always send out medical reports on all the physical findings that we get from each participant. So this is one of the things that they rely on. So they usually get, they always get a medical report on the physical findings from the evaluation. But we also do newsletters where we usually reflect the main results from the different ways of the evaluation. And some of them are targeting more the parents, while others target more the children or are more focused on the children, and we provide also activities for them and try to make the communication of the results easier. And that was also a challenge, how to produce information that children could understand regarding their health. And obviously, this newsletter evolved during the years, and according to the new image of Generation 21, also accompany this type of communication. Besides this type of feedback to the participants, we also try to make the project more visible to the society. And for instance, we also did some scientific conferences that where we present Generation 21 results over the years. And for instance, this one targets healthcare professionals that were involved in the recruitment of the birth cohort, but also health professionals that were responsible for the healthcare of our children. And although this conference targets health professionals and it was a scientific conference, we always invite parents and participants for it as a way of getting them to know what science is produced with their contribution and with their data. This was another scientific meeting that was organized for us. It was on the 10th years old evaluation anniversary of Generation 21. And here we invited members of several other European cohorts in order for them to also present their results. But it was also a way for us to present what type of data we were collecting and possible trying to establish future contributions and network between birth cohorts. Sorry. Yeah. Whenever possible, our results are also disseminated in the lay press in order to also keep the visibility of the project for the society, but also for the participants. This one is one of the last activities that we did when we were launching 13 years old evaluation, and these outdoors were placed all over Porto, so all over the city, and it was a way of getting in touch again with the population and a way of trying that participants recognize also again the logo, but again the project, and was a way to make again Generation 21 more visible. One of the project website is probably the most used form of communication with the cohort that we have. In the website, you can find all the information regarding the project itself. And again, we were very concerned about the image of the project, of the website. And when our kids were 7 years old, we decided that it would be nice for us to invite them to be the image of the project website. So these kids that you see here are in fact participants from Generation 21. And this happened also when we redid the website all over again at 13 years old evaluation. But again, we keep on using participants as image for Generation 21 websites. As to social media profiles, because nowadays most of our participants do in fact use social media, Generation 21 is on Instagram. And because we decided on this social media, because in fact we don't have that much human resources in order to keep this alive. So that's a big challenge that we have. But we decided on Instagram because it is in fact one of the most social network that is used by Portuguese youth nowadays. So we use it as a way of communicating also with our participants. And here in the Instagram, beyond information on the projects, or on relevant issues regarding their life. For instance, when COVID hit, we published weekly updates information on the pandemic in Portugal, but also information that we thought it would be useful for kids of 13 years of age regarding COVID. But also we try to promote activities that engage participants and that engage them in order to collaborate with us. For instance, these are a screenshot of our Instagram, and here participants were challenged to contribute with small videos on different subjects. And for instance, these ones reflect an activity that was coordinated by the Portuguese Health Council regarding the World Health Day. So they contributed by expressing their feelings and their opinions regarding this World Health Day. So, and I'm finishing up, I think, yeah. So regarding, now we are planning the next evaluation that hopefully will take place next year. And we are in the process of discussing new challenges, because this is the end of these are the lessons are now in a critical phase. They are entering university, and it is a big challenge to see how we can work out an evaluation and a physical evaluation of these participants in this phase of their lives. So these are some of our funding entities, which I have obviously to acknowledge, and I will also like to thank all the participants and all the families of Generation 21 that have been working with us for these many years. So thank you.
Thank you, Ana Cristina. We have some questions for you. The first one would be, do the adolescents participate in the design of the communication tools themselves? Do you ask them for their opinion when you are designing, or they collaborate with you in the design of these communication tools?
Yeah, in the beginning, that didn't happen that much. So when we started, we didn't know quite a lot about communication, so we didn't do it. But now we have maybe a biased way of doing it, but we have a group of participants that they are very much involved with us. So those are the ones that usually respond better to all the solicitations that we do. So we do try to get them to work with us, especially in these last years, because when they were very small, it was very difficult for us, and even to, because the one that spoke with us were in fact their parents or their mothers. So now they are in a place where they can actually be more involved. So we are working and we are trying to, for instance, regarding this Instagram social media, we usually ask them, a group of 2 or 3 or 10 participants, before publishing anything, we ask them for their opinion. So if it is okay, if they find something that is not that adequate, we do it.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions also about Instagram and social media. So yeah, you said that Instagram is widely used by youth in Portugal. Have you discussed the use of this particular tool with them? Do you know if they also use other tools like TikTok or something like that? Do you know what they prefer also?
Yeah, TikTok was in fact a challenge because some of them refer TikTok. For instance, Facebook, I really learned from it because I had no idea, but no one used Facebook in Portugal in this age straighter. So for me, it was even, I didn't know about it, but they taught me and they said, no one uses this Facebook. Don't bother with it. So yeah, but when we decided to launch the Instagram, as I said, obviously, I think that we have to invest further in social media. I think it's the way to get in touch with them more than, but they do like to receive for instance, the birthday card. They always say that it's a way of feeling that we care about them and that we think about them and so on. They also like to receive the newsletter. They like to see in paper, and they don't like it by email. So they like the paper, they like to receive the paper, they like to receive regular mail. But yes, we asked them what was the social media that they would prefer to have in Generation 21. And obviously TikTok also was mentioned, but as I've said, unfortunately, we cannot make it to be in because we don't have a human resource that is dedicated only to that. So we had to make an option, and we did it by Instagram. But yeah, and I think it's one thing that we should try to invest more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another of the comments we have goes into that direction of the resources also, because it's very it's a decision, a smart decision to go where the youth are, but also it requires resources, and there is often a pressure to keep up on this social media presence, but it is often difficult to implement. So have you faced these difficulties to implement your presence in social media when you decided to go onto Instagram, for example?
Yes, we did, for sure. So, and it is even regarding the financing entities, is something difficult to make them understand that it's important for us to keep this active. I don't know, but obviously this also relates with the Portuguese setting, and most of our financing in Portugal is very much biomedically driven. So sometimes it's difficult to get them to understand why this type of, it's not a laboratory, it's not something, and why it is so important to keep in touch and to get them engaged with us. Because if we lose participants, the validity of the project might be challenged, and I think that it is rather difficult to get, at least for us, it was difficult to get resources dedicated to the social media, and that's why we, because we have to make a decision on how far we can go. So, and that's one of the critical points for us, is in fact having the human resources dedicated to it.
One last question before I hand it over to Isabel. Did you continue to communicate with the parents when the children became teenagers?
Yes, we did. So we focused more on the kids because we felt that they wanted to be acknowledged as the participants, but obviously all the communication goes also through the parents. So the parents are always, because they are in fact, they are not adults yet. So even we had to obviously go through the parents because legally we have to do it. So the parents are always, the communication always happened through the parents also. So even though we try to contact the participants, we send the mailing and so on with his name or her name, the parents always knows when we are contacting them. So that's a thing that we always do.
Okay, thank you, Ana Cristina, and over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Ana Cristina. I'm pretty sure we'll be looking at Portugal in the coming years to learn how to communicate and engage with young people. So our next presentation is from Generation Scotland, and we have actually 3 presenters: Robin Flegg, who is Chief Operations Officer, Claire Dolan and Rachel Edwards, both Communication Officers. So ladies, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's just see if I can share my screen successfully. Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today about how Generation Scotland did public engagement during the pandemic. As Isabel said, I'm Robin Flegg. I'm Generation Scotland's operations manager, and I'll be giving a general introduction and then handing it off to Rachel, who's our digital engagement officer, and Claire, our recruitment coordinator. So what is Generation Scotland? We're a family cohort study that looks primarily at genetic and environmental influences on physical and mental health. We have 24,000 participants in 7,000 families, and we did our initial recruitment in between 2006 and 2011, and we recruited from 18 plus, and we are actually an open access resource for researchers who want to come and do this kind of research using our Generation Scotland families. In 2019, we received funding to double the size of our cohort and to extend the generations in our families from the age of 12 and up. Much like the Viking study, we're planning to use online questionnaires and postal samples via SpitKit for genetics and biomarkers, and then to use linked health and administrative data to track the health and well-being from birth to death for our family members. And also, of course, sending out questionnaires, doing those kinds of contacts as well. So this funding started in November 2019, and we were working towards a launch in autumn, getting our ethics in place, making our communications plans when, in March, the pandemic hit. So I forgot to mention that earlier photo was the Generation Scotland team in November 2019 at the start of our funding. This is the Generation Scotland team now, and you can see that we expanded greatly over the course of the pandemic. We had to adjust to remote working, as I'm sure you all did, but also adjust to bringing in all these new members of staff remotely. We made a major shift from figuring out how to launch our next round recruitment to focusing on COVID-19 research. And as a result, we brought forward a lot of our plans to increase our public and participant engagement, and we had to adapt to this new online world. So, as I said, we did COVID research, and what we did was we created COVID surveys, which were our COVID life surveys. And from lockdown in mid-March to mid-April, we got our first COVID life survey up and running. It is a study of UK adults, not just Generation Scotland participants, but anybody in the UK was welcome to join. We did 3 rounds of surveys. The first was in the first lockdown, the second was in the first loosening of restrictions, and the third was in the period of the second lockdown, basically as soon as we could launch after Christmas. And we had 9,000 volunteers do all 3 rounds of questionnaires, but we had about 16,000 volunteers in the first wave. As we looked at what was happening in the pandemic, and as we had in mind what was happening, what we wanted to do with Next Generation Scotland, we realized that the teen community was not being looked at, and the impact on them by the pandemic and lockdowns was immense. So we created Teen COVID Life, which looked at people between the ages of 12 and 17. And we did 3 rounds of that questionnaire as well. And I forgot to say this was only in Scotland, where we had almost 7,500 participants. And again, we ran the first wave during the initial lockdown, the second wave when they returned to school in August after the first loosening, and then the third wave we did during the exam period in the spring, so had a rather smaller return of participants. And this was open to anybody in all 3 waves, whereas COVID Life was restricted to the same participants. And as we analyzed the data from COVID Life, we realized that there was actually quite a difference in reaction to the pandemic in some ways in the rural communities in Scotland, and it's about 16% of the Scottish population, so not a insubstantial number. And so we got funding to do a rural COVID Life, which we did in October, November 2020. And this importantly was designed with rural communities, and Claire will be speaking about that later. So now I'm going to hand it off to Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm the Digital Engagement Officer for Generation Scotland. You'll have also heard that I have a bit of a split role, and I do communications management for Viking too as well. I'm just going to talk to you a bit about digital engagement. So before the pandemic, as Robin was mentioning, we had so many ideas in place. We had the idea of doing in-person activities, and all the consultations were kind of lined up to do in person as well. We didn't have that much online activity at all. And obviously we're in the office a lot working together and coming up with ideas together. So during the pandemic, we had to adapt quite a lot to that. Obviously all working from home. We had to adapt a lot of our activities, moved a lot of our consultations online, and we also had to increase our online activity. So that meant increasing our social media presence as well. So before we launched COVID Life, we had in plan the idea to do next Generation Scotland newsletter to get people ready to go from Generation Scotland. We had to adapt that slightly, and so we turned it into a newsletter to the Generation Scotland participants to say, we're doing COVID Life, this is great, come to this instead. Yeah, despite all the lockdown things going on, it was a way to reconnect with them as well. On top of getting people from Generation Scotland, we also went through Share, which is a register for volunteers aged 11 years or over. For people in Scotland, you basically just sign up as a public member, and you can say, I'm interested in research, and then groups like us can go to them and say, can you send out an invitation? So we did that, and that was one of our best ways to get people on board. As I said, we increased our social media presence, so we did a range of organic and paid social media. That was across, so the organic was across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and then our advertisement went on Facebook and Instagram. And we got about 10% of our volunteers through social media, and it cost about 50 pence per advert, per person to recruit in. And if you add in the time that it took me to make the adverts, it cost about 80 pence probably per person recruited. We also did that through that a lot of targeting work. So we went for with some general work, but then we noticed, as is quite common in biobank research, is that we didn't have that many male participants. We had a lot of very highly intelligent people, and a lot of them were the older generation. So we started targeting male people, as well as people who didn't necessarily have a higher education, and people aged 18 to 30, just to see if we could get those groups on board. In addition to all that, we wanted to kind of connect with the community, and we launched a blog. And we kind of spoke about how we were coping with lockdown in the hope that that would connect with other people out there and make them understand that we're going through it too. Through all that, we did actually set up a dedicated COVID Life page, but in addition to having a Generation Scotland page, it didn't really work because we ended up having a lot of content across both platforms, and me being the only person to put the content out was a lot of work as well. So we decided to drop the COVID Life page and bring everything back into that Generation Scotland name. For Teen COVID Life, that was led by Stephanie Sinclair. She's since moved on, but she was on full and she was volunteering her time, which we're really appreciative of. And what we did here was we did a lot of consultations because we really wanted to ensure that both the young people getting involved and their parents were happy with what we were doing. So we sent the information sheet to young people and parents to get them to read it and let us know if there's anything confusing, if there's anything we want to change. And obviously we altered based on their feedback. We did a lot of our recruitment in this study through SHINE, which is the School's Health and Wellbeing Improvement Research Network. So what they do is that schools sign up to their initiative, and yeah, we send, like, the schools sign up to their initiative. Sorry, I'm just stumbling a bit. Schools sign up to their initiative and they invite them to come to surveys, and then they can get feedback on their pupils. And so we created a lot of participants through that. Basically, the schools would send them the survey and ask them to take part. And in addition to doing that, we got feedback from the network just to kind of make sure that what we were asking them was clear and understandable. And what we promised the schools when they got their pupils to complete the questionnaires was customizable reports, particularly for those schools that had the highest number of pupils involved, because obviously we couldn't do personalized reports for small numbers in schools because that might be identifiable. We found that was quite labor intensive to do lots of customized reports for each individual school. So in the following surveys, we decided to do more general reports. So they still got reports, but it wasn't necessarily as specific to them, but it also meant that we could then include the schools that didn't necessarily have as many pupils to get a more general overview of how young people were coping. We also did a lot of social media for this as well. We felt it was most important to really involve the teenagers in this. So any of our advertisements and a lot of our organic content was all about two of our really, really great volunteers who volunteered their time to talk about the study and why they got involved and what it meant to them. And the aim with that was for them to reach out to other teenagers and speak to them on their level and get them involved. And we actually found that they had higher engagement across the board, whether it was organic or whether it was paid for social media. In terms of the paid for social media, engagement with those types of adverts had 3 times more engagement than some of our general adverts, which we tested out just to see if there was really a big difference, and there was a huge difference. Like Anna, we were very Instagram focused. We did look at Snapchat and TikTok because they are really big leaders in social media for young people. And we found that with Snapchat, after a bit of research, it was really hard to understand how your content was being engaged with. So you wouldn't necessarily know how many people had viewed it or interacted with it. That's kind of the whole point of Snapchat. It's supposed to be quite a private social media, which is fantastic if you're doing personal accounts, but from a business perspective or from a biobank or research perspective, it's not extremely useful because you want to know how good your work is doing. So we went with Instagram. TikTok, we had a few concerns about some confidentiality, which hasn't quite been worked out, but we are putting it on the peg for future. And we also did an Instagram live with the teenagers as well, being that they could ask us anything they wanted, they could submit questions. And if they had any concerns, they could raise that with us there, and that went down pretty well as well. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Claire to talk about Roll COVID Life and our other PPI work.
Thank you. I'll try to click that. Okay, so as we mentioned, we launched the Rural COVID Life questionnaire. I went too far, haven't I? I have. And that was led by our wonderful colleague Ali. And Ali is actually from a rural community in Scotland, so she was perfect to lead this initiative. And we had volunteers write some blogs to document how they were feeling throughout lockdown. And we also did social media like we did with Team COVID Life and got 20% of our volunteers through that way. But it worked out being a little bit more expensive, and it was about £2 a head for people who came into the study who interacted with the advert rather than the other COVID Lives that were a little bit cheaper. But one of the best things about Rural COVID Life was our PPIE group. So as we've discussed before, we looked at the COVID Life questionnaire and we wanted to make a specific one for people living in rural communities in Scotland. So Ali reached out to consult with people living and working in rural communities and people who had some real expertise in important areas like tourism, business and mental health. So we had some people on the panel who owned fishing companies, people on the panel who worked in the Scottish Government, and we had discussions with them about what key issues were affecting people in rural communities during lockdown, before lockdown, what concerns people had coming out of lockdown, and any positive things that came about as a result of lockdown as well, because it was not all doom and gloom. So then the COVID-led questionnaire was adapted with this consultation in mind, and a PPI group separate from the consultation group was formed in order to talk through the questionnaire. So the PPI group all spoke with Ali on the phone at least twice before they joined the group, because of course we were doing it remotely rather than face to face, and sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating coming into this online space and maybe people don't have their cameras on and you're talking to a blank wall. So that was a really good way to build rapport and make people feel comfortable, and of course to describe to people what we wanted to do with them, what taking part would involve. And then once everyone had a phone call, there was a general Zoom call that took place, and it was really important that we used Zoom because at the time that was one of the platforms that it was easiest to phone into, because of course when you're working with rural communities, sometimes there can be connectivity issues with internet. So we tried to make sure that as many people as possible were included. And our PPI members ended up being crucial in promoting the survey within the community. They were fantastic. They took part in TV interviews, they were on the radio, and they were just spreading the word as well organically. And we have kept in touch with this PPI group. They have been with us from the start to publication, and we're currently writing a descriptive cohort paper in which some of the PPI members are co-authors on the paper. So that's something that we're really proud of. And often with engagement activities, it can be really easy to miss out people who live in rural communities because it's hard to travel to. It's difficult to get there, and they're quite small communities, whereas when you do it remotely and you get in touch with them, people are really, really engaged and they want to get involved in these types of activities. So moving on to a more hybrid level, we managed to do a tiny bit of face-to-face. We did a digital photo exhibition. So we got a little bit of funding to photograph volunteers and their families living across Scotland. We had 10 people and their families take part. And then the photographer travelled and did the photographs, so that was face-to-face and safe and outside. And then we did the follow-up interviews over Zoom. And it was an opportunity for the volunteers to share their perspective of what health challenges they should be, or we should be investigating, not them, we'll give them a break, what matters to them and why they took part. And we're going to have a digital exhibition where we're going to share these volunteer stories on our website, and this is an example of one of them that I really love. And we hope to share this exhibition with our social media channels and try and have a discussion online about taking part in health research and why it's important in researching families. Another way that we're engaging with people right now and across, well, not across lockdown because we're just doing it now, is a Pse lesson plan. So Pse stands for Personal and Social Education, and it's a lesson that you do in school in Scotland, and you do it from when you start school to when you finish school, and it's designed to talk about things that you might not discuss in other kind of lessons. So you discuss society, morality, relationships, health, exercise, those kinds of things. And we are working closely with Shine again to develop this lesson plan. So it's designed to teach young people about research, introduce the ideas of different research methodologies. So there's quantitative and qualitative research, what it is, why it's important, what we can do with health research, who uses health research data. And it's been designed so that it has different types of activities, videos and discussion points, and it can be used differently for different age groups. So maybe some of the younger pupils would want to do more of the activities, and some of the older pupils would want to discuss the discussion points, which kind of bring up the ethical parts of research. And importantly, we have a poll at the end of the lesson plan where we're hoping to assess the appetite that young people have for research and ask them questions like, would you answer questions online? Would you donate a sample? How do you feel about data linkage? How do you feel about following your health records? And every time a pupil answers the questionnaire, the identified results are shown. So as we go on, us and the pupils will be able to see what other people think.
One more minute, please.
Oh, okay. And that's going to be launching soon. And you're lucky that I've come to the end. So what we have learned that there has been an appetite for public engagement, which has continued throughout the pandemic, and that even people that are hard to reach, that live in more rural communities, want to take part if you make the effort to go and engage them. And remote engagement might continue to work well even when the pandemic finishes someday. And we look forward to using the experiences that we've learned to enhance our recruitment and our public engagement when we finally launch NextGen Scots. And this is a really important slide. This is the team that we work with, so thank you to everyone for their really hard work. And this is our collaborators and our funders. And this is us. So this is our website or our socials if you want to follow us. And thank you everyone for listening and for your time. Oh, escape.
Thank you very much. Yes. We can stop sharing your screen. 1 second.
Ah, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the questions that we have is about PPI members that appear as co-authors on publications. Who are they, and do they have an academic profile?
So there's about 5 or 6 people who have agreed to do it. Everyone was asked, and some people wanted to and some people didn't. And my colleagues write in the paper and they've been involved with it a lot more. But my colleague was really clear about how much effort it takes and how much is involved in publishing a paper. So some people chose not to do it. And of the people who chose to do it, some of them have published in the past before. So some of them are pretty aware of the process and what it's like, and are quite academic. But it's been really, really valuable for us because Ali, that I spoke about, that led this, has moved on from Generation Scotland, and so she's not here anymore. So they have a lot of knowledge that we don't actually have. So it's been truly invaluable having them on the paper. Can you hear me?
Monica, we don't hear you anymore.
No.
Yes, I'm having technical problems. If Isabel can take over, if you hear me.
Yes,
Thank you.
We have 2 more questions actually coming from me. So the first one is, did you have any concerns regarding the quality of the data that you collected, since you were using quite new channels to collect the data?
So the data was actually collected via Qualtrics questionnaires, but it's, in terms of the social media, it was more about figuring out the click-throughs, wasn't it, Rachel?
Yeah.
So we were able to kind of do Google Analytics and about it.
Yeah, so we did Google Analytics just to see who went through the adverts. We also had, when you do pay for adverts, you get like a full, basically, spectrum of like who's gone from the advert to then go do your survey. So you can see who's gone through the full process and who hasn't, just because of how you link. It's called a Facebook pixel, and it just sits in the background, and then you can just see how people move through your survey, and if they've finished it, because I've asked for it to do a convert button, and it just goes, this person's finished, great, that's then one person who's fully completed.
Okay, thank you. In your opinion, what are the pros and cons of using online tools based on the experiences you've made now under COVID, as compared with using more traditional methods like face-to-face?
In terms of engagement or in terms of data collection?
In terms of engagement.
So one of the pros is definitely what I mentioned about being able to reach people that it would take you absolutely hours to travel to see them face to face. And it means that we're able to come together, even though it's online, and have discussions that would take a lot of time and money to do. It takes less time and money to do it digitally. So that's definitely a pro. The cons are that some people will still have connectivity issues, that not everyone is digital and online or wants to speak to you on the phone. And it it lacks a little bit of warmth and you know, personability and sitting and eating cake and drinking tea and the things that you normally do. And it's a big incentive as well for taking part in activities, is the buzz and the going there and the chatting and the free food, and that's what a lot of people enjoy about it, and that's all been stripped away when it's been done online. So when I spoke to the people when we were doing the interviews for the photography exhibition, one question I kept getting asked over and over again is, will it be in real life one day? Am I going to be standing one day looking at the photo in real life? So although there's pros to digital engagement, I think most people are ready now to finally get out there and see each other in real life.
Yes, there's a risk that there's an online fatigue, which I think we're all experiencing as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we need to move on. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. And the last presentation actually is mine, so I will have to share my screen.
I think I'm back.
Yes, we can hear you
Yes.
now.
Yes, good. It wouldn't be fun without technical problems.
No.
So I will present now our last speaker today. It's Isabel Budan-Diosne from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and she's going to be presenting to us her research in this mapping process, mapping the participant engagement in European cohorts that she's been conducting in the last month. So please, Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yes, so we've been doing some work to map participant engagement practices in European cohorts. And when I'm saying we, this work is being done under the umbrella of Biobank Norway, but we work in close collaboration with BBMRI-ERIC. And this workshop is one of the ways for us to also collect information and exchange experiences with the different cohorts. So just want to make sure that I can page down. Doesn't work. Okay, why not? Here, sorry about this. So you all know about the background. We've been discussing this multiple times already. It is challenging to retain participants in longitudinal cohorts for a variety of reasons, because young participants are becoming adults and maybe moving on with their lives. It can be challenging to engage specific groups like ethnic minorities, and it's also difficult to follow people over time because they might move or might be busy with their lives. So there are a variety of reasons why it is challenging to retain people in longitudinal cohort studies. But the problem is that we need to be able to retain them to enable the course to be sustainable. And so we need to have continuously new data collections taking place to update the quality of the information we're gathering. So the objectives of this study is to map participant engagement practices and tools in selected European cohorts. We want to investigate the experiences of the different cohorts. We want to identify whether there are any gaps and needs in terms of future engagement. And I think we've already discussed quite a few during these two sessions. And an indirect objective is also to identify potential routes for future collaboration on participant engagement. So I really hope that having these conversations now during this workshop is a way to break the ice and enable our cohorts to talk together in the future. So we have several research questions, and I'm sorry, those of you who are participating in the study have already seen these questions. But one of the first things we want to do is to identify the tools and methods being used by the cohorts to recruit participants and collect their consents, maybe digital consent platforms, websites, social media, or through community events. We've heard that Born in Bradford, for example, was doing a lot of local events. And we have a particular interest in looking at methods to target specific groups like ethnic minorities or young people. We are also interested in identifying the tools and methods used by the cohorts to inform participants about the study. So we've been discussing all these different methods, websites, newsletters, social media, public events, infographics, videos, and get a sense of which tools are perceived as efficient or less efficient based on the experiences from the different cohorts. We will also identify methods for providing individual results to participants in the case these are provided. And Shona gave us a very good example today of how it can be done. So when we're talking about individual results, it may be not only genetic research results, but also results from analysis of biological samples, clinical assessments, diagnostic findings, or even personalized health guidance if any cohorts are doing this. And we are very interested in looking at what is the perceived impact of the feedback, not only for the researchers, but also for the participants. This study is also to identify methods used by the cohorts to collect data from their participants. So which channels are being used with tools such as questionnaires, the use of devices, of wearables. We see that some cohorts are starting to use this, whether they are doing in-person measurements, interviews, or using cohort apps, or using tools on mobile phones, or doing any data linkages, for instance, to electronic health records, to welfare payment data or geographical data. And we're interested in learning whether the cohorts are using any incentives to encourage the participants to provide data. We'll be also identifying methods used by the cohorts to involve participants in the life of the study. May it be individual interviews, for instance, or we've heard from many of you that community or participant advisory groups or panels may be used. Participants and ambassadors are used by some cohorts, workshops, town hall meetings, and it's very interesting to see how the information provided by the participants is incorporated in the way the cohort functions and is being designed and developed. Finally, we will look at dedicated resources that the cohorts have to work with participant engagement, the barriers and limitations they see to participant engagement, and the types of wishes they may have for the future, and the types of help that the cohorts need to promote participant engagement, for instance, in the form of best practices. So we have a way of looking at participant engagement in a very broad manner. So what we've been doing is that we looked at existing networks of cohorts. We looked at the Eurochild cohort network that is set up by the Life Cycle project, a large EU project, and that is trying to connect approximately 40 cohorts, pregnancy and birth cohorts together. We'll look also at existing networks such as the CHICOS network and the birth cohort networks. These two networks also have been set up by European projects. In the UK, there is a network called Closer, that is a network for UK longitudinal studies, and that is very much preoccupied with participant engagement. And ELSPAC has also been setting up an engagement group that has been gathering cohorts with an interest in engagement. So looking at all these networks, we identified approximately 50 cohorts that could potentially be approached. And of course, it was very difficult to make a selection. So the strategy we used is that we wanted to have a mix of cohorts with either one or several generations of participants, cohorts that were featuring engagement methods on their websites. We were interested in inviting cohorts that are at different stages in their life cycle. So both cohorts that have been running for a while and cohorts that are more recent. We were interested in cohorts including diverse groups in terms of ethnicity and cultural background, Our primarily area of interest is cohorts in Europe, but we are also open to invite cohorts from Australia or New Zealand. And we were very much interested in having a geographical spread across Europe. So we identified 15 cohorts, and some of you are parts of these cohorts. We invited 15 cohorts and 14 accepted our invitation. And as you can see from our list, most of the cohorts are pregnancy and birth cohorts, longitudinal cohorts going over a long period of time. But we also had 2 twin cohorts that we wanted to talk to because we saw that they were using innovative methods for participant engagement. And we also talked to a cohort in Australia and in New Zealand. So what we did is that we had first contact by email, and then we had semi-structured digital interviews of approximately 1 to 1.5 hours. We did that between April and August this year with the 14 cohorts. We shared the interview guide beforehand, and we had the informed consent of the cohort representatives to do the interviews. So what is the status now? Now we have talked to all the 14 cohorts, and we just finalized the simplified transcriptions of the interviews last week, actually. So this has been taking quite some time. But our objective now is to set up a matrix that will be summarizing the content or the information that we have received during these interviews. And to give you an idea, the matrix looks like something like this, where we, for each cohort, describes very shortly which recruitment methods are being used, if any new recruitment is taking place, what are the consent methods being used, whether it's paper-based or digital, what kinds of tools are being used, both to provide general information about what happens in the study, but also to provide individual feedback to the participants, what kind of data collection methods are being used, how the participants are being involved in the life of the study, what kind of resources are being used, what are the barriers to engagement and wishes for engagement. So it takes a little time to set up a matrix like this, and we try to summarize the information in a simple manner. But we see that the course are living entities, so they're constantly doing new things that we want to incorporate in this matrix. So this is now that I'm going to disappoint you all because I cannot give you results yet, since we are just in the process of putting the information in the matrix. But what I can do is give you some sort of a teaser based on our first impressions from reading through the data. But this does not count as results. It's really important to emphasize. So what we see is that several cohorts are ambitioning to become multi-generational cohorts. So they started with pregnant women, and now they want to move on recruiting the children of the children, so having a span of several generations across. There seems to be some gradual transition from using paper-based consent solutions to electronic platforms for consent collection, although we see that some cohorts are still using paper-based solutions because it enables to have a face-to-face interaction with the participants. So it will be very interesting to look a little bit more at the data to see what are the pros and cons of using these different methods. The cohorts seem to have varying experiences regarding the use of communication channels, and this in particular applies to social media. And I cannot tell you more right now, but as we've heard from the discussions now, it seems that some of the social media are working better than others over the course of different experiences regarding their use. We also see that it seems that the cohorts are using really mixed methods for data collection. So from what I would call the traditional methods like questionnaires to more innovative or different methods using digital tools, using wearables, using data linkages. So there's a greater variety of methods used to collect data that has traditionally been the case in cohorts of this kind. We also see varying experiences regarding the use of involvement strategies. And really my gut feeling is that there is a lot of trial and error being done, that the cohorts are trying different methods to see what works. And again, we are hoping to see patterns of what may work when looking at the different cohorts. There is clearly some shared concern regarding engagement of certain groups, and this applies to the young people, the children becoming adults, but also ethnic minorities. In some cases, also men may be difficult to engage. What we clearly see also from the presentation we just had from Generation Scotland is that the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have boosted the use of digital solutions, and the cohorts have been reporting that this has been a very steep learning curve. And finally, the cohorts are reporting that they all have, or most of them experience limited resources in terms of participant engagement. Are very interested in discussing experiences. So this is really based on our first impressions. Now we have to look back at the data, spend much more time digging in the data and to see whether we see patterns that can be useful for us to draw any conclusions from. So the next steps are as follows. We will finalize the metrics and we'll need to go back to the cohorts to make sure that the information we have summarized is correct. And then we will organize a writing group with the cohorts that are participating in the study to lay out the main points or the main recommendations we can make based on the information we have received. And we are hoping that the work we are doing now is opening for potential collaboration with the cohorts, both in terms of sharing experiences, but also in terms of maybe finding ways to fund participant engagement across studies. So we're looking at potential funders like Horizon Europe, for instance. So this is it from my side. This is our team from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health working on these data. I would like to thank again all the cohorts that have very kindly agreed to participate in this study and provided lots of information that one we have now to go through. And we'll come back to you as soon as possible with results once we have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel.
And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. There we go. Well, thank you for this last presentation, presenting your research of the research of your mapping. And now we have some time for open Q&A. We have one first question already for you, Isabel, that concerns electronic consent. How does this electronic consent comply with ethical regulations?
So I can't answer that across when it comes to across cohorts, because we have not looked at this specifically. But what we know from our own experience is that ethical regulations vary from one country to another. So in some countries, it is relatively feasible to use digital signatures for electronic consent, for instance, while in other countries, it may be more difficult. And this very much depends on the local legal framework, and also on the ethical committee reviewing the research. So from my experience, this is developing quite quickly in countries such as the UK. It's taking more time in countries such as Norway, but I cannot give you a more precise answer to that, just that it is very context dependent, depending on local requirements.
Yeah, thank you. I think that now, of course, we can open the floor to all the panelists to exchange ideas amongst them. One of the things that I think that was a conversation that was taking some traction before, and we had to stop, was about social media and the available resources that you might have to really implement all the social media campaigns as you would like to do them. So if you have any more comments about that, now would be a great moment to continue with that conversation. And one of the questions was for Generation 21, but it can be extended for any of you. What usually does the trick to make the case to ask the funders for social media resources? So what could you do to try to convince funders that those resources are crucial to continue with your work?
I can talk about our experience. So really, unfortunately, I don't have the answer for it because we didn't manage to get that type of funding. So we had to do some, I don't know how I could say it in English, but we had to redirect some of our funding from other activities in order to get someone to deal with the social media. Obviously, it's not a full-time job because we cannot do it, but we did manage to get one of our researchers that works in Generation 21 and has other type of activities to get some time to deal with the social media and work with some of the advertisements that we do on social media, and also engage participants in those activities. But again, it is really a struggle because it's not dedicated human resources to it. So it is a challenge. I don't have an idea how we can deal with it, but from what I know about the Portuguese funding entities, it's not a very easy thing to do. I think it would be more easy for me to ask them for more, I don't know, blood sampling analysis and stuff like that than to ask them for someone to work social media. But again, I think that might be also an issue of time, and probably they now, and COVID also helped us to realize that we have to find alternative ways of getting in touch beyond the traditional ones. So maybe now it would be easier for us to get some funding for that.
I can just say from our perspective, I think Rachel's role kind of has developed throughout the pandemic. We are fortunate enough that, as I said, GS is also an open access resource for researchers to apply, and we get funding. We have a funding stream through that is not quite so constrained as one that might be through funders, and that can help subsidize some of the things that the funders don't fund from our perspective. So we've been able to do that. But I mean, we're also in the position of we're recruiting, and I think the funders do recognize for recruitment, you do have to engage with social media. So there is some funding in our comms budget for it. So I think there's a distinction between ongoing engagement with current participants and recruiting new participants. And maybe the funders recognize the importance of social media in the recruitment, but not in the ongoing engagement. And that might be a distinction that's maybe worth thinking about, and how we explain we need both.
I can echo some of that. I think it's important to have budget for engagement and social comms, because I mean, I explained on Tuesday that we don't have a dedicated team as such for the common stuff. But recently, when we did our some research around COVID, we took some of the findings to some of our lay participation groups and asked them how we could present these to communities. So these were sort of in the shape of pictures, diagrams, etc. Not too many words, but just something that would just capture people's attention. And the feedback that we got from them was that the messages that we designed were not very appealing, so they gave us feedback to change them, how they'd be more acceptable to communities. So, but having somebody who is trained in media would actually, you'd be able to sort of overlook, look at stuff like that and see what, how your audiences will perceive it. So it's important to have like both funding for both comms and engagement, in my opinion.
Isabel, do you have any more comments at this point from the audience? I think we have gone through all the questions. Ah, there is one popping up right now. I will read it. It's for you, Isabel. So will your report also contain a part directed to funders to stress the importance of participant engagement? I think it's important that it's an expertise and not just putting a message on social media. So to highlight the importance of hiring people who know about scientific communication. For example, we, Healthy Brain Study in the Netherlands, appointed a marketeer for public engagement. That is a very crucial point, that the communication in social media is not just posting whatever, that it requires actual expertise.
I think it's a very good point that we should emphasize, and without having looked at all the feedback we received from the course in very much detail, we already have a good sense that having resources dedicated to do this work is really critical, and which I also think is something that the funders largely do not acknowledge for the time being. So yes, I think it would be a very good point to raise if the data we have in our metrics confirms that this is a concern, which I think will probably be the case. I have one question to all, if that's okay. I'm a bit curious about new ways of collecting data, not only through the good old questionnaires, even if we now very often are using online tools, but more indirect data collection methods, asking the participants to wear some kind of Fitbits or wearables or digital tools that collect the data on their behalf. And I'm wondering whether this is something that you have ever had the opportunity to discuss with your participants, how they would look at, having to wear a device for a time that is collecting data on them, not being actively providing the data themselves. And we are, in a way, doing this all the time while we are carrying our phones with us. We're giving lots of data to Google. But is it something that you have been discussing with your participants?
So I can, from an LSAT point of view, yes, we have done various, so we've done things like activity monitors, and we've had participants who have worn a kind of watch style activity plus other measurements, and it's very popular. Our experience is that they really like it, and in fact when we've talked to them about it, it's something that they're very keen on, because it's, the alternative for us is that people have to come to our clinic, which is just not always very easy for them. So they're very keen on any other way of collecting data that just makes it much easier. So I would say it's definitely very popular, but it's difficult. It's difficult to get good quality data sometimes. It can be really expensive. So it needs thinking about very carefully.
So, and from our side, we as I've said in the presentation, we get a hold of their perception during that qualitative study, and we asked them what if they were available to use some wearables or to collect data through, for instance, an app or a mobile app or something like that. But our participants always said that they might use it, but they really prefer coming to the evaluation, the physical evaluation. So our participants, at least, they really value having contact with the research team. And I don't know if this will change. Probably it will as they grow older, but at least for now, they always value the way that they prefer to be evaluated is through a face-to-face interview and not through using some kind of wearables, because we talked about it in the research team, but again, because it is a rather expensive way of collecting data, because we need to acquire the devices. So before doing it, we went to them and asked him, and obviously this is a qualitative research, so it's but at least for those that participated in the focus group, that was our so that's why in the 13 years old evaluation we didn't try anything. We now are talking about it because they are 17 now, so maybe it's different. Yeah, but I think that it's an interesting but a challenging question, and it depends on the context, I think, again.
Yeah, we've used activity monitors with children where they've had to wear them for a week, and if they've worn them constantly for a full week, they are waterproof. So it measured things like sleep, physical activity, that kind of thing. I think the children enjoyed doing that, but I think and then they were sort of collected from schools, so we had that input on a face-to-face level as well. But we've recently just done something on a mobile phone with youngsters. They agreed to have this app on their mobile phone for 2 weeks, and that measured things like their screen activity, sleep patterns, activity, etc. I think most of that was fairly well received, other than the only one issue that they said they didn't like was having their screen, the wording monitored. So they weren't happy about text, etc., but pictures, that kind of thing, they were fine with. And that was done for a pilot that we were working with an American university. So it did work well with youngsters and sort of 14 plus, but just that reservation about the keyboard being monitored.
And just following on from that, we've done a study looking at Twitter data and looking particularly at sort of mapping people's mental health through the tweets that they do. And it was a pilot study, and people were really nervous about it. I mean, we did it and we got, I think it was around 800 participants to take part in it, but people were definitely very wary about it. And we're just about, we've got funding to link to transactional data. So this is data from supermarkets, like the big supermarket chains. And we're kind of very carefully doing this because, again, it's really sensitive. And people have very strong views about it. So we're doing some focus groups at the moment and some qualitative work looking at that, but that's definitely an area that we want to explore more, for sure.
Yeah, we haven't done this in Generation Scotland yet, although I know our PI is quite keen to look into apps and wearables and things like that. I think also the other passive data collection is what Lynn just mentioned, linking to different data sources. And one of the things we're doing is wording our consent forms for the new round of recruitment around linking to administrative data, which means like education records and beyond health records. And we went out for feedback on the wording to explain what that meant. And because we haven't linked to it before, there's not a clear sense of what data we could actually get. And interestingly, the adults didn't seem to raise many concerns about this at all, but we went out to our this teen advisory group, and they're like, okay, will you see my grades? Will you see if I've been excluded from school? We need to know what actual data you're linking to. And so I think anybody working with teens, they're far more savvy about this kind of data. And ultimately what we said to them was we would, before we linked, we would communicate with them to say what exactly we're linking to and what kind of data it would be, so that if they didn't want to be linked, we wouldn't link them. But the adults had no concerns whatsoever. It was interesting.
Yeah, interestingly, we were just having a conversation about that this morning, because we were looking at this transactional data project that we're working on. And one of the things that we find all the time in ELSPAC, and I'm sure other people do as well, because it's a longitudinal study and participants have been involved with the study for a long time, in our case 30 years, they tend to trust you and they tend to just agree with what you want to do. And we're having to say, no, you really need to actually read this properly, go away, have a think about it and come back. Because we're finding people are just going, oh, I know you wouldn't do anything, you know, we trust you completely, so where do I sign? You know, so I think you do have to be quite careful in longitudinal studies that actually people know what they're consenting to.
That's such an interesting aspect on trust, because you create a relationship with them. And there's also this idea that that you will not do anything wrong for them. It's the same with your general practitioner. If you've known them for 20 years, just trust them. But it's interesting to know that teenagers are getting more savvy and concerned about data than some adults are, because also they know the implications maybe better than we do, because they were born in this digital datafied era, and they know the ramifications and implications of data flows more than people over 30 years old, for example. So that's really interesting to highlight. Do we have any more? We have time for one more topic. Do you have, Isabel, something more on your bucket list for things to ask? You can also ask each other, hey, panelists. You can.
I'm hesitating to ask, but I know that one topic that is also very difficult for the course to address is the use of incentives. And it maybe has not been that common to use incentives with the previous generations, but with the new generation, question is whether incentives should be more commonly used, because as you were saying, the young people have different requirements and wishes than the mothers or of the previous generations that were involved in this. So I'm wondering whether you have any strong opinion about what should be done when it comes to incentives with the new generation, the soon-to-be adults or young people.
So personally, I think you have to. I think well, certainly in the UK, the culture is that you give incentives and they work. You know, we know that they work. What I think is really interesting is differential incentives. So when you're giving different incentives for different groups of people. So, you know, for the hard to reach or the disengaged, participants. There's lots of evidence to show that it works if you give them, more money to come to take part in a study, and it's ethically really sensitive, and we've never been able to get it through an ethics committee, so we've kind of really backed away from it. But a lot of the UK commercial agencies like NatSen and Ipsos Mori do that as a matter of routine. I think that's a really interesting conversation. I'd love to talk some more about that.
Giving money is one incentive, but for young people, things like that have more value to them in terms of work experience, for example, their career building, things that they can use in the future, that seems to attract more. So it's I think, like I said, different groups, but for youngsters, I mean, yes, the money works, but something with more meaning that's going to be useful for them for the future is probably the way we're looking at it. But also similarly with adult groups, especially if you've got lay participation groups, etc., that are from deprived communities where they've not had the opportunity to be able to develop skills. It's been a journey for us to develop some of those people to a point where they can actually speak to different audiences, they can represent us at various platforms, etc. And it's around confidence building, but there's also, communication skills, presentation skills, etc. So those sort of things are equally as valuable to people as our monetary ones.
And feedback of results. That's why I was so interested in Shona's talk today, because that definitely, when you ask participants, that comes up really high, doesn't it? That one of the things that incentivizes them to come to take part in the study is feedback. We've never managed to do it, but again, interesting to explore. Can I just mention, I'm going to have to go in a second, and Isabel, you mentioned the ELSI engagement group, so I just wanted to quickly flag up and say I'm just trying to pull together an agenda for that engagement group, and if anyone is interested in coming along, it's an online group, please feel free to contact me. I think the topic next time is going to be how lots of studies are now going back to face-to-face data collection, and we've got different experiences of how participants are finding that. One very large UK study is finding that their older participants are reluctant to come in. We're not finding that yet, but obviously quite worried about it. So we thought we would pull together a group of people and just see what's working and what the concerns are. So please do contact me and I'll add you to the group. But I'm going to have to go now, so I better say bye. It's a great conference. Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It is actually time to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you to all the speakers that have participated in both sessions of this workshop. This was really, really valuable information to receive from you, and thanks for sharing what you're doing and how you engage or get involved with your participants. That was really, really interesting, and this could lead to many more conversations, I am sure, but unfortunately we've run out of time, and I will hand over to Isabel so that she can say a few last words, and then we will say goodbye.
Yes, and this is just to say thank you so much. It's been really inspiring. I've learned a lot, and I really hope that this is the start of something bigger, that we can keep in touch. We will do through our study, but also, really take the time to get to know each other better and create some collaboration across the course. That's really what I'm hoping for. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.